This is a video lecture for week 5 of the Comp 2 class. Um, had some interesting questions this week. Several people asked about the Romantics and their emphasis on emotion. And the question was why? Why did they do this? And is it wise? Is this a good idea to value emotion over intellect? Um, as to why, I don't know. Um, it's true that they seem to be very hungry for some kind of emotional experience um, that was denied them otherwise. You can look at the way that human beings were living in this time, gathered into these busy, crowded, increasingly industrialized cities. Um, there was a hunger for beauty and a hunger for escaping um, human society, if you will, and finding a connection in nature again. And the Romantics really did privilege emotion over everything else. That's where we get this idea of a romance, right? We use the word a little differently now. The Romantic movement in art was about expressing strong emotion, but now we use the word romance almost exclusively in its relationship to courtship. But courtship is about that, right? There's this intense um, emotional thing that happens between two people when they are in love. And we still do, to this day, privilege that feeling over pretty much everything else. Um, Feeling in love in our culture, broadly speaking, is what legitimizes two people spending their lives together. If two people fall out of love, then the assumption is that the best thing they can do is separate, because being in love is how we're supposed to live our lives. And if I'm no longer in love with someone, then I should find someone else. But this doesn't lead to good places, really. I mean, um, you see a lot of chaos in our the social construct of the family that's prevalent in our culture right now, because people are seeking this. And advertisers use this against us, by the way. Um, every advertisement, it hits emotions, not intellect. If you think about it intellectually for 2 seconds, you can see it's all BS, right? Love is not what makes a Subaru at all. It's just not. So, but they can show us these pretty pictures and play thrilling music and say impressive words, and they hit us in our emotional um, selves, and that causes us to be motivated to do things that we wouldn't do otherwise, like go out and buy a Subaru. And so I think that there needs to be some balance, honestly, if people are going to live a healthy life. Maybe privileging emotion above everything else is not so wise. And if you look at the lives of the people who began this idea, they were pretty chaotic and pretty uh, damaging lives. I mentioned that when in your short essay question prompt, that these guys were lunatics when it came to um, living lives that were uh, beneficial to the people around them. They left in their wake a lot of destruction. And I showed that this is still with us. We still have people whose lives are all about riding an emotional high, and it leads to decisions that are not beneficial to a lot of people that you know, depend on a person. um, so um, I think it's a question we should ask ourselves. I think that we don't ask that question. I think that the Romantics kind of won in terms of the way that our ways of looking at the world have changed since the advent of the Romantic movement in art and literature and music. We by and large don't question the idea that feeling intense, pleasurable, or just intense emotions in general is what we should be about spending our lives doing. Um, Another question, and this is one that arises a lot in comparative religion classes. Um, it's one of the older um, atheist arguments that you see Prometheus and these other Roman gods who are falling and rising, right? Or the ancient gods are everywhere. I mean, when you go look into paganism, you look into mythology, there's a whole lot of gods who die and rise again. And these are connected with the seasons, connected with, we have a death and rebirth going on all around us in the natural world. And a lot of mythology is focused on this. And the question is, if these things are considered myths, why is Jesus not considered a myth as well? And some people do think that. Some people do argue that Jesus is a constructed mythology and that he didn't really live and do the things that he's said to have done in the Gospels. There are two ways to look at that. There's two sides to that coin. One side is exactly that you have all of these mythologies, you have all these dying and rising gods, you have this repeated again and again in mythology. And so then you can see Christianity and the story of Jesus' life and death and resurrection in the Gospels as another myth. But the other side of that coin is that Christianity has always claimed that Jesus was a fulfillment of the religious instinct in people, that humanity had been specifically prepared for this moment, for this advent of this Messiah. And so if God is real, and if a big part of God is the idea of death and rebirth, and people through their own efforts and intellect are trying throughout human history to worship God or understand God, you would expect to see a lot of dying and rising gods. And so Jesus represents the pinnacle of that idea. And so, that's another way of looking at it. There's a very famous series of articles called the Blatchford Controversies, where the theologian and apologist G.K. Chesterton is writing on these very things, and he's responding to an atheist who has written a book saying exactly that, and attacking Christianity as just another myth. And Chesterton basically says the reasons that you say you don't believe it are the reasons that I say I do. You say that there are all these legends of and myths of dying and rising gods, and I say I would be shocked if there weren't, because this is the religious instinct in people. We all have a need for this story somehow, and then Jesus comes along and fulfills that. So there's two ways of looking at it. And one side, it's something that seems to be on the side of Christian faith, and the other side is on the side of atheism. Like so many of these things, it's not definitive. And that's why the message boards and places where atheists and religious people argue with one another never really go anywhere, because none of these arguments are conclusive in and of themselves. They just aren't. You're not going to find a definite proof that religion is all mythology and inventions of people. You're not going to find definite proof that it isn't. That's just one of the curious things about theology and philosophy and belief. A lot of the most important questions that we can ask ourselves don't have answers that are final and definitive. Another question is in the painting Liberty Leading the People. The woman is portrayed as being a hero, but why does she have her breasts exposed? That's a great question, and I want to use this opportunity to talk to you a little bit about how you interpret things that you read or see or hear. If a human being makes something, a work of art, that implies decisions. I can't just throw a bunch of cookware down the stairs and record that and call it music. There has to be choices being made. I have to decide to do one thing and not do another for whatever reason. And in a painting, it's the same. Even Jackson Pollock, who just splattered paint on a canvas, right? He was kind of famous for being an artist who anybody could do this, right? You look at a Jackson Pollock painting, he literally did just throw paint at the canvas. And you think, well, I could do that. How could you know? But it turns out that if you analyze Jackson Pollock's paintings with the right kind of mathematical understanding, there's fractals in there, and they don't exist in other paintings like that. There was a design to what he did, and this shows choice. It shows a decision to do one thing and not do another. And so when you're looking at anything produced by anyone, you can ask yourself this question: why this way rather than some other way? And that helps us get at a way of knowing how to ask the right kinds of questions about a work of art or music or literature. Um, why are the goddess of liberty's breasts exposed in this painting? And so that's the first thing you ask yourself is, why was it this way and not some other way? And then you have to ask yourself, what do these things mean, right? So exposed breasts, right, can mean a number of things. Um, uh, it's a powerful image, right? People look, right? That's why, exposed breasts are going to draw attention in this culture because it's part of our standards of modesty. But breasts represent a lot of awesome things: nurturing, motherhood, also desire. And if you think of liberty, right, as an idea, as something that people are going to follow, you might want to portray it as beautiful, attractive, daring, unconventional, nurturing, and exposed breasts say all of those things. And so that would be one. That's one way of talking about why the breasts of the goddess of liberty are exposed in that painting. Um, Another question: did Charles Dickens have a moral or spiritual background to influence his writing styles? And the answer is yes and no. Um, Dickens was not a Christian in the traditional sense, but his books are full of Christian morality. Um, you know, the characters in his books are painted so vividly and so interestingly, partly because they represent human beings in ways that we can relate to. And his ideas of morality, the villains and the social circumstances of injustice and poverty and oppression that he depicts in his books are all part and parcel of traditional Christian morality, right? The greedy people should not abuse children, right, for money. That's a subtext of Oliver Twist. Um, and so, but it's interesting to note that traditional Christianity amongst intellectuals of Dickens' time was so out of fashion that when Dickens wrote Christmas Carol, he had to invent his own kind of Christian mythology. He did not go back to Christian ideas about Christmas. The ghost of Christmas past, right? The ghost of Christmas present, the ghost of Christmas future isn't anywhere in a traditional Christian Christmas celebration. You'll see a lot of other weird things like a tree decorated up and Santa Claus, that require some explanation, but you won't see ghosts. And so I would say that Dickens had a very Christian morality in many ways, but was not himself a traditional Christian. Um, Last question: why did countries search for national identity in this time? And this is kind of an interesting question to ask because we live in a world of nation states. We ask people, what country are you from? Um, we can define individuals by their country of origin. This was not always the case. This arose out of the breakup of the Holy Roman Empire, as you had different kings and different rulers deciding for themselves what religion their populace would follow. Um, Prior to this, you have a kind of a loose association of peoples. Many ancient names identify a person not by their country of origin, but by their city of origin. Um, Leonidas of Rhodes, right? Well, we would call him a Greek, but there was no such thing as the nation of Greece at that time, as we would understand a nation. There were all these loosely affiliated city-states that shared a language and a culture, but they sometimes went to war with one another, and they would unite all to fight off the Persians or somebody else. In Europe, as Rome was conquering and ruling over things, you had tribal peoples with very, very loosely defined borders geographically between different groups. You could say, this chieftain rules this area, but what exactly is the area? Well, it's what my people can take and hold. Um, and so you see this very fluid um, definition of borders and definitions of how people talk about themselves and identify themselves by tribal things, by cities of origin. But after the breakup of the Roman Catholic culture that was the Middle Ages, you see this kind of accretion into these very sharply defined borders of nation states. And one of the inevitable outcomes of this has been really, really widespread conflicts. Um, Nationalism uh, is responsible for a great deal of destruction and warfare. World War I, World War II were uh, instituted, well, they became what they were because of these allegiances between different nation states. Um, Even the Civil War uh, is a result of this kind of question. The Confederacy wanted to be seen as pretty close to individual nations, whereas the Union said that nope, states are just borders that we've drawn on the map of America, but we are all Americans. And you know, the question of slavery was the touch point of all of this, but the desire of the South to keep their slaves um, was justified by this idea that in the borders of Georgia or the borders of Mississippi or the borders of Alabama, we Georgians and Alabamians, we call people from Alabama, Mississippians, we decide what laws our state will obey and not obey. And so um, this kind of grouping of people together in an identity based on a nation state is not ancient. It's pretty recent in human history, and but it's the world that we live in now, and we don't question that world because it's what we're used to. And that is that. I want to briefly talk about your dogs are going crazy. Somebody's what's going on. Um, I want to talk about your article review. I've put up the instructions for it. They're pretty basic. I'm not going to require a rough draft. I'm not going to go over MLA formatting. These are things that a Comp 1 and Comp 2 class should cover. If you do have questions, though, individually, feel free to ask me. But it's fairly short and fairly straightforward, I think. But if there is confusion, I want you to contact me and let me know and ask me. This will be due at the end of week 6. I will have the option to post it up when I get the week 6 unit finished.